Well, I just wanted to say that it's a real pleasure to be here, or to virtually with all of you. And I want to thank Yanis Chamiglakis for the invitation, Leah Bergen and the museum for making this virtual visit possible, and Emily Jackson for designing the wonderful flyer for the event, which I think made a real difference. Transient Matter, which of course I didn't have a chance to see in person when it opened, it brings together photography, video, and found objects, from barbed wire to waste to life vests. The show asks us to think about forced migration in terms of what remains in the sense of what continues to exist after a dangerous border crossing, but what remains also in the sense of what or who stays in place, and the new objects, stories, and practices that are created in order to keep order, to keep some people in place in what might feel to them like no place. The show suggests that through what remains on Lesbos, the Greek island that lies near a border, we can see together two dimensions of displacement that are often kept distinct: mobility and immobility. These arrivals were not planned. They are interrupted journeys, and they involve broken families often. And as the novelist Valeria Luiselli has written, the problem of trying to tell the story of migrants in an indeterminate state is that the story has no beginning, no middle, and no end. It seemed fitting to me for this reason to turn to myth today, to turn to Euripides' Electra, a story that not only picks up in the middle and adapts a myth, as all tragedy does, but that has no authoritative version, and one that also takes place near, if not on, a border, and that takes on the problem not simply of getting lost in transit, but of trying to call political attention to that state. Euripides' Electra concerns one of the most popular stories in all of Greek tragedy. The background, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is that Electra's father, Agamemnon, has returned home to his palace in Argos with his concubine Cassandra after spending 10 years away in the Trojan War. He is murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. But Electra, Euripides' version of Electra, opens some years after this. Clytemnestra has taken over the palace where she now resides with Aegisthus, who helped her exile her son, Orestes, Electra's brother. Now, in this version of the story, which is unique to Euripides, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus have also displaced Electra from the house. They've moved her to the cottage of a farmer whom they appointed as Electra's husband. The arrangement is meant to protect their rule over the city by preventing Electra from marrying a noble person and bearing a potentially avenging son. But the tragedy goes on to depict the siblings, Orestes and Electra, who re-meet on the border of the city and plot to kill Aegisthus and their mother, Clytemnestra. So without going into all the details of the murders, I should just say that the siblings are successful at killing both people, but quickly regret their matricide. And the play ends with their forced but separate migrations from the city of their birth. Orestes will leave again as an exile, though this time carrying the stain of matricide. Electra will leave as the object of a second bridal exchange. She will be married off again, but this time by an authorized guardian, by her closest male relative, her brother, Orestes. Now, like all the tragedies that are about this family, this house, Electra explores the threat that disorder in the family poses to the maintenance of patriarchy. But what is striking about this depiction of the royal family is that Euripides makes use of a broad topos of political displacement and resettlement in order to explore what happens when kinship networks break down. People move, apparently, but how and to what political effects? Electra's dislocation from a home and her relocation to a new one constitute the fulcrum of this tragedy, which at first glance emphasizes the ways that she has been differently displaced from her brother. He roams cityless. She stays in Argos in a forced countryside marriage that she likens to death, homelessness, and the condition of a phugas, the capacious Greek term that is hard to translate because it is not a legal status and can designate a person exiled, on the run, a fugitive, someone displaced, and someone in need of refuge. So although the tragedy figures the siblings' predicaments in unusually similar political terms, it nevertheless focuses attention on Electra's situation. It is curious, though, that Athenian tragedy frequently figures women as individual, even wandering phugadas, because women in ancient Greece were not banished in real life, as Euripides has pointed out. In their efforts to reconcile this apparent tension between fiction and fact, readers of Greek tragedy have tended to assume that the phugas connotes a historical category of political exclusion for men who were free to move autonomously, and therefore that it's associated with wandering and movement across borders. When a tragedy like Electra deploys the phugas, when it deploys a political category that is actually constituted by the exclusion of women in order to figure a woman, it seems to critics to do so allegorically, as a way of capturing a dynamic of dislocation and a loss of already deprivileged civic standing that is still not really a state of being a refugee, which is a condition reserved for men. So I want to read Electra's statement, and I'll go into how this is actually something that she says about herself, her statement that she is a phugas differently. I'm going to suggest that when she calls herself a phugas, she is establishing a literal equivalency with her brother, a phugas who lacks an oikos too and is forced to move. So her deviation, as we'll see, from the standard and masculine meaning of a refugee is not simply an effort at creating a separate or distinct notion of feminine exile or the state of being a refugee as a woman, although it is that. It's also an effort, I think, at defying the gendered terms of the category altogether. Because women in ancient Greece may not have been made, exiles in the proper sense of the term, which is to say, as men were, that does not mean that they did not move. They did move. They moved from one oikos to another under guardianship between men and in the service of creating the kinship assignments that are used to make citizens and order men and women in the polis. So this is another way of saying that women moved or were moved through marriage. And like any practice, this traffic in women could go wrong. And in Electra, it does. Or more accurately, Electra declares that it does, and therefore that her marriage does not count. And it is from this spot that she considers herself a phugas. Now, if this is right, if this emphasis that I'm going to be placing on her role, on her agency in declaring what her marriage means, then Euripides' Electra seems to offer an innovation on a convention that we see in tragedy, tragedies like Medea, in which the denial or the suspension of marriage makes a woman a wanderer. Because Electra is married, but she denies that her marriage counts and adopts a term, fugas, that is associated with wandering to describe a condition of immobility, a life of cohabitation in her childhood polis. Electra's speech transforms a political category that typically connotes a condition of external displacement for men, and in most tragedies also for women. But rather than hardening the fugas's connection to wandering, her speech uses the term to capture a condition of internal displacement that results from the forced movement of women in marriage, while raising a question most clearly at the end about how men might be just as implicated or similarly implicated. And that will become clearer when I go into the end of the play. So for now, I want to go into some of the details of the text and sort of show you how I come to this conclusion. The farmer introduces the audience to the different effects that banishment has had on the two siblings, on Orestes and Electra, by focusing on physical movement. He describes Orestes as a homeless Fugas who moves from city to city, and Electra, his wife, as a paradoxical maiden wife. References to Orestes' moving around reverberate through the tragedy. Characters describe him as a roamer, suggesting he exists in a perpetual state of mobility and homelessness. But the play also establishes proximity between the siblings' predicament. Most important in this regard is Electra's own deployment of the Fugas, which she uses to align her situation with her brothers, in spite of the apparent differences in their relationship to territorial space. She says her brother, the Fugas, dwells in another land, a wretched wanderer, while she resides in a toiler's cottage, also a Fugas from her father's house. And then the chorus makes this link even clearer by bringing Orestes' exile in line with his sisters rather than the other way around. They describe him as a long wandering Fugas, not primarily actually from the polis, but like Electra, from their father's home. So at first glance, the play appears to map the siblings' banishment, their dislocations, along conventionally gendered terms or lines of physical mobility, formal political membership, and territorial boundaries. Men move outdoors, belong to a polis, which they can lose, and they fall victim to external displacement, external from the polis. Women, by contrast, are moved on behalf of marriage toward a destination, a home, where they are supposed to remain. They belong first, but also only fully to an oikos, which is their link to a polis in which they are always already semi-outsiders. So long as women are trafficked from one home to another, theirs is a kind of movement that is never supposed to end in homelessness, which is to say, in the loss of a domos and an oikos. The question then is how Electra, married and at home, comes to see herself as a kind of refugee, as a Fugas. So consider first that Euripides' version of the Electra story is unique among all of them because it marries her off. He removes Electra from her familial home through a seemingly aberrational marriage. And the complex details that he gives this marriage plot make possible a slew of new political questions about the meaning of the Fugas that would not be possible without this kind of the curious details and the ways in which it's aberrational, which I'm going to go into now. The clearest reason that Electra's marriage to the farmer does not count in her eyes is that it has defied the rituals of marriage, which require that one's closest male relative, which would be Orestes in this case, because her father has died. It requires that your closest male relative act as a guardian and exchange Electra with another man. The transfer between men bestows relations of kin between two families and establishes a new oikos. This patriarchal arrangement constitutes not just a house, but also a family, one function of which is to produce legitimate offspring. When uncontested, the traffic in women enables the conferral of political kinship locations, assignments of kinship to individuals. Men are legible to a polis most immediately as husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons, women as wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. So membership in the polis depends on membership in an oikos, and these membership and marriage practices make the oikos appear as a pre-political sphere that simply furnishes the conditions for political life outside and beyond it. But in the 5th century BCE Athenian context of the play's performance, the fact that Aegisthus was not Electra's guardian, but gave her in marriage to the farmer, could have been grounds to dispute the marriage. Electra speculates that this is the reason the farmer does not want to consummate their relationship. The man who gave Electra to him lacked the authority, he says, to do so. But this understanding of their chaste marriage makes Electra's virginity less the constitutive feature of the failure, the marriage failure, as it is often understood, than its sign, the mark of a prior aberration, a transgression of ritual, and an attempt at bridal exchange outside of proper kinship. According to Froma Zeitlin, Euripides' ironical innovation in creating a married Electra while at the same time preserving her traditional status of virgin makes her a still greater social misfit than her violent family history already has. Nancy Sorkin-Rabinowitz finds that the marriage innovation, which keeps Electra a virgin, works to confer on her a contradictory status, married but a maiden still. Richard Seaford investigates the structural effects of such a failure of transferal. Not only does it produce a contradiction for the woman that keeps her implicated in two different lineages, it generates, he says, a contradiction which may endanger the continuity of one or the other of them. But another reading of this marriage situation is possible, and I want to explore it here. I want to consider a detail that is rarely mentioned in criticism, that although Electra's relationship is unconsummated and improperly authorized, it nevertheless unfolds under one roof, a shared house, which socially, if not legally, defined marriage in the 5th century of the play's production. Kirk Ormond has written in a different context that the state of matrimony was not legally defined in 5th century Athens, which makes it quite difficult to determine exactly what constituted legitimate marriage beyond the fact of cohabitation. I mean, at least if we're talking about being able to prove this. Court disputes in Athens, for example, as we know from Demosthenes, could and sometimes did take cohabitation to be synonymous with marriage, although this was, of course, contestable as well. So what this means in the case of Electra is that her maiden wife status, while a contradiction in terms of political kinship, she inhabits both positions, does not simply express the real truth about her, as if she were really improperly married. Instead, Electra exploits the interpretive complexity, the kind of ambiguity that always inheres in acts that are used to define marriage. In order, she does this, I'm suggesting, in order to offer a defiant reinterpretation of her situation. Now, the active role that Electra plays in declaring herself unmarried in marriage and equating the state with being a fugas may be easiest to appreciate when she refuses, anainomai, to accept the chorus's invitation to participate in this festival for Hera, along with the other wives of Argos. Electra doesn't tell the chorus her real reason for opting out of the festivities, and she even declines their subsequent offer to give her the proper clothes she says she needs to take part. The most powerful of criticism on Electra, or I should say on Electra's use of political language to describe her own predicament, has found great meaning in this scene. Yet even these interpretations seem to downplay the role Electra plays in rendering herself a fugas. Thus, although she acknowledges that Electra's opting out is quote unquote self-imposed, Froma Zeitlin argues that Electra's refusal to participate simply publicizes a feeling of inner isolation that cannot be disentangled from her isolation from the civic life of the polis. For Kirk Ormond, who is even less inclined, at least as I read him, to see Electra's agency here and focuses instead on her banishment by Aegisthus, Electra's confrontation with the chorus illustrates that to exile a woman from the city, as he puts it, one does so by exiling her from proper marital relations and thus from civic involvement in official cult. For Ormond, the play is reminding us of women's second-class political membership. Even in exile, he writes, the relation to the city that Electra has been denied is not a direct political relation. The marriage that is no marriage, Zeitlin maintains, deprives Electra of the gratifications of sex and children. It deprives her of her proper social status and of her normal role in the family and the community. This denial, Zeitlin says, makes Electra virtually an exile, and in her gloss, agamos, ateknos, apolis, and aphilos. So critics conclude that Electra is a fugas because she has been forced to give up the limited membership activities that constitute women's already attenuated relationship to the polis. Though they more or less acknowledge that her refusal to take part is self-imposed, readers do not find in Electra's fugas language an example of a political claim or an attempt at making meaning. They stress her status in a problematic bridal exchange that failed to bestow on her a clear kinship location and blocked her from actualizing the already deprivileged civic standing that is afforded to women who stand inside of proper kinship. Now, on this line of interpretation, the effect of Electra's self-presentation as a fugas is merely to confirm the gendered division of membership in the polis. But to qualify Electra as a virtual exile, as Zeitlin does, may simply remark a woman's difference from a man and risks reconnecting the fugas to its constitutively masculinist associations with external displacement and autonomous physical movement. Just as women are almost but not quite citizens, they are almost but not quite refugees. So the difficulty with this approach to the play, as I see it, is that it underappreciates the ambiguity that I mentioned is always inherent in the kind of cultural and discursive acts that constitute marriage, and also, which we can talk about, in the discussion, that constitute refugee claims, or at least their adjudication and the making of those claims, what counts as a real need for asylum. And this approach that I've been outlining also directs us away from appreciating the fact that Electra contests one meaning of her bridal exchange, that she is married to the farmer, to declare another, that she is not. Electra is a fugas then, not because she is banned from acting as a wife, she is not, but because she decides to occupy two kinship locations at once, and act as if she lacks a clear one. Now, critics who note the problematic nature of Electra's marriage to the farmer see this, of course, but in their efforts to understand what exactly makes her claim or makes her statement or makes her description as a fugas political, they tend to focus on her political inactivity, her opting out, rather than on her evaluation of her own marriage and what the political implications of that are. Now, she does use the conventions of patriarchy to stake that claim to being a fugas, right? Remember, her reason is that she has not been properly exchanged by a male guardian. But she is still insisting that she can refuse to accept the valuation of herself as married, or at least this is what the audience is let in on. She doesn't make that explicit to the chorus, for example. So to begin to kind of open up some of the unsettling implications of Electra's self-figuration as a fugas, it's useful to consider what Orestes, her brother, has to say about his sister's marriage. So Orestes accuses the farmer of aiding Electra in the pretense of a marriage. The purpose of marriage is a recurrent theme in Electra that characters tend to take up by way of their family's own improper marriages, all of this sort of relationships gone bad that are in or in the background of the play. So Electra's exchange, her movement between Aegisthus and the farmer, from her, I guess you could call him her stepfather, to her husband, was originally undertaken to secure the political stability of another irregular household, Clytemnestra's and Aegisthus's. That relationship was made possible by Agamemnon's murder. But Agamemnon's physical displacement, his departure, his murder, is a response to Clytemnestra's displacement from her role as a wife in the oikos. So when he returned from Troy, as Clytemnestra reminds Electra in the play, Agamemnon kept two women in the same house. His introduction of Cassandra into the home called into question Clytemnestra's position as wife in the oikos. So similar to Electra's situation, it is cohabitation that seems here to make or unmake political kinship ties. Cassandra's presence in the home blurred the line between wife and concubine, putting into crisis not only Clytemnestra's position, but all the kinship assignments in the oikos, the initial work, in other words, that was accomplished by the marriage between Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, by her traffic. But when we look more closely at Clytemnestra's account, the problem is not just that practices of traffic, cohabitation, and procreation can be used to make or unmake political kin and citizens. It is that these indeterminate practices are also used to ground unstably a system of gender and gender hierarchy that is therefore inherently insecure as well. When a husband errs by rejecting the woman in his house, Clytemnestra tells her daughter, the wife desires to imitate her husband and acquire a new lover. The problem here is that sexual relations that approximate real marriages make shams of the real marriages. In confounding this difference between a real marriage and a fake marriage, they undo the work of the traffic in women, which makes gender. As Gail Rubin says, it transforms biological males and females into men and women. When wives become concubines and concubines wives, Clytemnestra suggests, women become men and men women. The wrong kinds of unions, of which there are many in this play, expose the fragility of the gender hierarchy that subordinates women and keeps their movement through marriage looking unpolitical. And now Electra begins with an account of a woman's marriage to one man, but it ends with her impending marriage to another. Following the murder of their mother, the siblings' uncle, Castor, shows up. He delivers the news to Orestes that he must leave Argos, but not before giving his maiden wife's sister to his friend Pylades, who will take her as his wife to his home. Now, because Orestes is Electra's guardian, the marriage should restore the non-binary Electra to an oikos and bring an end to the kinship trouble that has made her, in her own eyes, a fugas. But things are not so simple. As I suggested a few moments ago, the traffic in women does not simply make women, it also makes men and fathers, husbands, brothers out of biological males and political kin out of men. This means that the marriage that is supposed to restore Electra to a clear kinship location should also reman Orestes, whose masculinity was called into question not only by his sister, who criticizes him for hesitating to murder their mother, but also implicitly by Aegisthus, whose usurpation of Orestes' guardian role effectively dislocated him from his role as brother in the gender-structured family. Orestes' brief return from exile to the outskirts of Argos, then, is more than a physical repatriation. He recovers his place as Electra's closest relative, which means his stay in Argos temporarily resolves the problem of his dislocation from kinship, which is typically, though not exclusively, associated with Electra. Castor's remarks to Orestes continues this mirroring between the two siblings to a certain point. The uncle draws a through line from their common origins, what he considers to be the wrongdoing of their ancestors, that's the common origins of the siblings, to their common acts, the murders, and finally to what he calls their common fates. But what exactly is shared about their fates, which will be lived out separately and differently? When Orestes claims some parity between them by lamenting that his sister is leaving him and he her, Castor rebukes him because Orestes has extended to Electra the sort of concern reserved for a man. Electra has a husband and a home, Castor explains, which means that she will not have suffered anything worth pitying apart from having to leave her polis behind. Castor's statements simply rehearse the standard polis view that women's deprivileged membership means they have an attenuated, not a non-existent relationship to a polis. He doubles down here on the gendered division of political membership, which requires that movement in and out of a polis means something different for women than it does for men. Electra responds by drawing attention to this double standard. She issues a rhetorical question about whether there is for anyone a greater misery than to leave one's patria. Now, this brief back and forth between Castor and Electra, it's very, very brief, but it is important because Castor has reiterated here a gendered distinction between home, domos, and city, polis, insisting that a husband and a home, what constitutes a conjugal oikos, is the only arrangement that really matters for a woman, as he does, is not only to discount a woman's tie to her polis, but more fundamentally, to depoliticize the traffic in women. The disagreement then between Castor and Electra would seem to turn on a question about whether women who move between cities count as migrants like Orestes, or are, no matter what, always merely women, which is to say objects moved between men, between domestic spaces, and on behalf of the family. Electra is taking issue here with the presumption that a marriage that takes a woman across polis boundaries is only incidentally a migration. She sees her marriage as a border crossing. What is at stake in eliding, in erasing the difference between a marriage and a migration is nothing less than the stability of the oikos polis opposition that Orestes momentarily unsettled when he lamented his sister's exile in equal terms with his own. Now, to see this a bit more clearly, I think it might help to kind of review the sense in which Electra understands herself as a fugas for most of the play. I've been arguing that her claim depended on her evaluating her removal from her family home as a failed traffic in women, rather than on her acknowledging this failure as though it were inevitable and entirely externally imposed by the men who arranged for her removal. So Electra demonstrates that the marriage is a failure by acting as a contradictory maiden wife. The crisis in her kinship position, in which she has a hand, has repercussions. It unsettles the meaning of gender, of her gender, throughout the play. Electra famously appears manly. This is captured in the Michael Kakoyannis film, Electra, very well, if any of you have seen that. And Orestes womanly, and both are implicated in each other's political terms. So the play's closing scenes return us to the scandal of this blurring, but also to its salutary critical possibilities. Because up until now, what seemed to matter for Electra was her kin relation to the man who gives her away in marriage. In other words, that it was not her male guardian, it was not Orestes, but Aegisthus. This seemed to make the crucial difference for her about whether she is or isn't really married, whether she is or isn't really a fugas. But now, at the end, the ritual of marriage, though properly performed, does not, in her eyes, resolve the political problem of her dislocation. The marriage produces it in a new form, in terms typically reserved for men, as a crossing of borders, as a loss of polis. When faced with the prospect of gaining a stable status through her authorized marriage to a new husband, Electra does not protest the marriage per se. She once again protests its meaning as a politically restorative act for her. And so on the eve of a new and proper bridal exchange, Electra reprises her fugas claim by reaching for the language of patria. Patria, as one scholar puts it, is what exiles are often deprived of and debarred from, because the term in Greek connotes both kin and polis. What is more, it may refer to both a territorial space and a political community that is delimited territorially, but we could add also that is delimited by blood or ethnicity. So Electra's use of patria then is noteworthy because it avoids choosing between the gendered terms of oikos and polis and instead conjoins them. She is, like her brother, losing both, and her response to Castor is therefore a piece with her earlier efforts to bring her condition in line with her brother's. His fugas condition is frequently figured as the spatialized act of roaming apolis. But that wandering is generated by his dislocation from their paternal oikos. So when throughout the tragedy, Electra uses the same political terms as her brother to figure her own condition, she not only protests the terms of her political value under patriarchy, she also protests her brother's. She figures her brother's exile in the supposedly feminine terms of her own exclusion from an oikos. The difference, of course, being that women could not create their own oikos, men could. So there is an important distinction there. Nevertheless, I really want to point out how they are being, the two siblings are being mirrored here. Now that she's confronted with the opportunity for proper reintegration into an oikos, Electra connects herself to her male sibling through patria, which is not just about physical movement, but also about kin, about fidelity to her natal, her family, we could say her father's oikos, and can talk about Electra's love for her father. For as Orestes himself suggests, the loss of a polis is also a loss of each other. Now, the end of Electra is striking because Electra suggests that her imminent and proper remarriage counts as a change in homeland, not simply home. To claim otherwise, as Castor does, is to assume first that for women, there is only traffic, not migration. And second, that the home lost by a standard fugas, which is to say by a man, is only the polis, not also the oikos, which encompasses family, access to political membership, and a place to live. What Electra's speech imagines then is a notion of women's mobility and exile that cannot be subsumed under an idiom of traffic, and a notion of men's mobility that cannot be subsumed under an idiom of territorial border crossing. For Electra, reintegration into an oikos might make her a wife, but it does not put an end to her life as a fugas. The issue here is not only that Electra, like Medea, lacks a familial oikos to return to should something go wrong in her new marriage. It is that, as the term patriarch suggests, the polis distinguishes two notions of homelessness that are, in everyday practice, impossible to disentangle. Thank you.